right with it.
I don't think so.
You're fair enough. You could be a real
I am.
blonde.
I'm
You
extremely tasty.
are.
Yeah.
Yes, you are. Welcome back. It's great to
Thank
see you
you.
again.
Thank you guys for waiting. I was signing a bunch of books and we got carried away.
You were signing a bunch of books.
Yeah.
So let's start out just for a brief moment because I brought up a copy of Matchup because I think this is such an interesting project. Some of you have heard me talk about it before. But this was a project of the International Thriller Writers Association. Karin can tell you about it. And she paired herself up with Michael Carita, who will be here with Nelson DeMille on October 5th. So Karin signed her story, but Michael can sign, she and Michael can both sign it serially, Karin tonight and Michael. And Nelson wrote with Lisa. Mm-hmm. So if you were here and got one of Lisa's books, or you still wanted the books with Lisa's signature, you can get Nelson's signature. Anyway, what was it all about, Matchup?
Me complaining.
Well, that's a good start.
Steve Berry. So Thriller Fest is every year in July, and it's for people who are in the thriller community, who want to be published, who just like thrillers. It's been pretty successful. I think 4 people have gone through the program and gotten book contracts. So
yeah,
it's pretty good if you want to get into thriller writing. But they did a short story collection. The short story collection benefits the organization, and it means that the dues are paid for by the short story collection. So if you join, you don't have to pay dues. But there was one they did called Face Off, and Steve Berry, who is the one who asked people to do all these things, had asked me to be in it. And I looked at the list, and all the guys had already paired up, right? And so I said, no, I'm not going to do it. And so then he asked me to do Matchup, and I said, I'll only do it if you do men and women, because that way all the guys don't, pair up, and it's just wrong to do that. And he said, okay, well, I'll do that if you help me get women to write, because normally women say no. And when the jacket came out, The Battle of the Sexes, and look, the guy's standing and he's got this big Glock, and the woman has this tiny gun, and she's going, hee hee. I said to Steve, this is why women don't do these things, because that is so stupid. And one of them, the woman was wearing a very short skirt, her ass was sticking out, her breasts were sticking out, and wearing, no kidding, heels that were like this tall. And
She was short.
right, exactly, because she couldn't chase the bad guys because she was too short. And I hit the roof over that, and I got everybody else, all the ladies upset, and Michael, to his credit, was very upset about it too. But so this is a story telling you that Steve will not return any of my calls now, because I just am constantly giving him crap about this because I hate the way it looks. But I thought it was great because you did, so you have Sandra Brown and C.J. Box. I mean, you'd never read a story by 2 people like that, right? Because they write such different stuff. Or Kathy Reichs and Lee Child did a great story. Diana Gabaldon and Steve Berry. Who,
not only a great story, but centuries apart. That
exactly.
was a real challenge. How you could bridge the century gap.
So it was really cool. And I chose to do something with Michael Carita because I think it's important to, for authors to help each other, and I liked his books, and I thought, well, I had never met him before, but Alifair Burke, who's my good friend, is a good friend of his, so that kind of vouched for him. And we wrote the longest story in there, and we thought it was funny to call it short story. And we delivered it so late that Steve didn't care what was in it, which was kind of by design. But the first review said ours was the best story, so that's the only review that matters. But we had a lot of fun doing it. I just got so pissed off by this packaging because I thought, why don't you just talk about the fact that, Jesus Christ, Diana Gabaldon, like a massive, massive bestseller, writing with Steve Berry. That just their names alone should make you really excited about this. And I sent Steve all these pictures of half-naked men and women cops like dressed in suits and things like that. And I said, this is what the image looks like to me, right? Because it just says women are stupid, basically.
Aside from all that, I've got to catch her. We each had a margarita along with a guacamole that I dropped up myself, so there we are. Which characters did you, because the object was to take, a character by each of you and force them to
Oh,
do
yeah.
something together.
The point of the story.
Who
yes.
did you use and who did Michael use? Because you guys write standalones and all kinds of different books.
Well, so Michael and I were talking, and he had a series a while ago that he stopped writing. And for Joe and I can't remember his name.
Was it The Private Eye?
Yeah.
Right. I love those books.
And I wanted to write it. I thought, well, since we're going to set it in the past, we decided to set it in the 90s because we didn't want to deal with technology and all that. And we wanted some kind of weather event. So we looked at weather events in Georgia, and there was a massive snowstorm that just came on very suddenly. And it was actually the first time that meteorologists were able to really predict a storm of that size, and it actually happened. Because that's when they had the Doppler radar and all that. But it just came through in about 3 hours, and nobody was prepared. No one had bought their milk and their bread. So people freaked out. But we set it there, and I put my character, Jeffrey Tolliver, there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. As a young man, still appreciative of the ladies.
I like Jeffrey.
Yeah.
I miss Jeffrey.
It made me want to write more short stories about him.
Did it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to keep him alive, really, would be to do stories
Spoiler
like
alert.
that.
Thank you, brother. Now nobody's
He
going to
didn't
buy
die in your story. That's not a spoiler alert. If you haven't read all of Karen's books, then, beware. But I figure virtually everybody here probably already knows this, right? Because you're all looking grim. There we go. So, The Good Daughter is a standalone, does not have any of your series characters. What inspired you to write it? Oh.
I got to take a picture of you guys later,
Oh,
so
this
don't
is for you
move
and your
until I
phone.
do that.
Okay.
Yeah. A couple of things inspired me to write it. One is I wanted to do a standalone again because the Will Trent novel I wanted to write. I needed to do a little more research about the topic. And the person I need to speak to is an FBI agent who just retired and is subsequently more busy than when he was an FBI agent. So we weren't in a position to talk about this. And so I thought, I really wanted to write another story about sisters because when I wrote Pretty Girls, I really enjoyed that. But then I thought, well, do you want to be writing sister novels? And then I thought, well, Lee Child doesn't worry about writing Reacher Goes to Small Town and Kicks Ass novels, so
Right, sister novels.
Exactly, right?
Even in small towns like Pikesville, is that the name of this small town?
Pikeville. So, and also I wanted to write about a small town because I haven't written about small towns since Grant County.
Right.
And it's sort of been broken, but it wasn't a very appreciative look at small towns. So I wanted to do that, but also I wanted to talk about this character I had been thinking about, and her name in the book is Gamma. And she's called Gamma because she was a physicist, and she studied gamma rays, and she worked at Fermilab and NASA in the 50s and the 60s, which you can imagine what that was like for her. And then she had to go home and take care of her parents who were ailing and give all that up, and she ended up getting married, and her vision for her life completely changed. And there was a line that I actually, it's in the book, and I'll paraphrase it. It's that she was pale as an envelope and just as likely to inflict tiny cuts in inconvenient places. And that was a note that I had written. I'm a real nerd. I've got an aqua notepad in my shower, and I write lines like that and it was there for 3 years. I cleaned the shower, but it was there, and I just thought about her. And I think it came from my 9th grade English teacher, who, as you know, I was very close with her from the 9th grade on. She was such a huge influence to me as a writer, as a human being. And she passed away a few years ago when I wrote this line, and I think it was about her because she was a difficult woman. I mean, even a week before she died, someone had given her these beautiful chocolates, and there's those descriptions that tell you where the chocolates were born and all that, and if they love their mothers. There's an apostrophe error in the little card. And we talked about that, and she wanted me to write a letter to the chocolate place, which I did, to let them know, because she thought they'll be embarrassed because people know this, and it'll lead to the downfall of their business, even though the chocolates are great. She really believed that. But she was really smart. She loved literature. She loved language. She loved grammar, obviously. But she was considered a difficult woman. And I think that that society is really wired to celebrate those kinds of personality traits in men. You know, really driven, really knows what they want, really smart, that kind of thing. Those can be really negative things for women. And so I wanted to write about her and to give her two daughters who, you know, carry that on into their generation as well. So, you know, it's a thriller. There's sex and violence, don't worry. But to me, that was really the heart of the book, was these characters.
What is the name, I'm having a senior moment, of the movie that was about the three women at NASA?
Hidden Figures.
Okay, Hidden Figures. I thought about, you know, about that because it was the same kind of thing. That it wasn't just race, it was gender, and it was a whole sort of a culture thing that went on in that movie, which I thought was a very good depiction of how life was. But I thought about it. Your title, The Good Daughter, is it deeply ironic or is it absolutely perfect?
Well, I hope it's perfect. Well, they're two daughters, and you know that at each time, each of them at one time in the book thinks that they're the bad daughter, and I think most daughters go through that. It makes it easy for me because I'm the youngest of three girls, so I know that my parents love me best. But I think we all have this idea of what kind of kid you should be, right? And just like parents have the idea of what kind of parents they should be. But I love this line that it's sort of something my grandmother said to me a long time ago, that Rusty, who's their father, married to Gamma, says that a father loves his daughters the way they need to be loved. And I think daughters love their parents the way they need to be loved too. And to me, does that make you a good daughter? I mean, are you compromising, or I don't know. So it's kind of a mystery in the book.
It is a mystery in the book. Rusty's a really fascinating character. Did the daughters come first and then Rusty when you were developing this book, or did you start with Rusty and go the other direction?
Well, you know, so I see his book over there, Greg Isles. We were in New York at Thriller Fest, and we went to one of these dinners that publishers have for authors, and we go because it's a free meal. And so it was a bunch of authors. Steve Barry, he'll show up for anything.
It's going to be a recurring theme.
That's right.
Your next book is going to be The Good Son. Right?
Yeah. In parentheses, not Steve Barry. He's a sweet guy. But Sarah Bladel was there. You know, just a lot of authors. And Greg and I were sitting across from each other. And this was a night that the excerpt came out in the New York Times about Go Set a Watchman, where it was revealed that Atticus Finch in that iteration had gone to a Klan meeting. And we all, you know, our phones started vibrating when this came out. And everybody was looking at it surreptitiously, except for me, because I just pulled it out. I was like, what's going on? Is it a cat? Because that's all I ever get. You know, everybody had a really shocked reaction because Atticus Finch was this character we all thought of as our father, right? You know, that was the perfect father. He was just an amazing, saintly kind of man. And Greg said, because Greg's from Mississippi, I mean, he's much more southern than me. When he talks, sticks come out of his mouth. And he said, I don't believe a man of that education, of that family and social standing in the South would ever do something like that. And I had just researched murder in Atlanta in the early 1900s, Leo Frank, a Jewish guy. And he was from the Northeast. He married a Jewish woman, and he moved to Atlanta to run a pencil factory. You guys this may ring a bell. There was a great Lifetime movie about this. And a young girl, 13 years old, Mary Fagan, was found murdered in the pencil factory one weekend. And I guess they couldn't find a black person it was convenient to pin this on, so they did the next best thing, the Jewish guy from the Northeast.
Right.
They pinned it on him and basically railroaded him and ended up lynching him. And there are photographs at the Atlanta History Center, and you know, there were so many lynchings that happened during that time, not just in the South. You know, in New York City, there are monuments to lynchings that took place during the Civil War because so many New Yorkers were against fighting the Civil War, and they lynched people. So in this photograph, you see the son of a United States senator, a congressman, the deputies, the sheriff, people who are really well-known people in Georgia standing in front of this man they just murdered, and his neck is literally stretched. And so Greg and I got into this argument, like a Southern off, about whether or not Atticus Finch would do something like that. And I always thought of Scout, like I said, Scout's view of Atticus when she's little is the way that a little girl looks at their father. That's why fathers love little girls so much, because they idolize them for the most part. And then, they grow up and they see maybe he's not that saint. And I wanted to write about that transition with Rusty, because Rusty is this small-town lawyer like Atticus Finch. He's certainly not racist, but he's found other ways to be horrible. He has his own moral compass, and he is convinced when he's right of something. And sometimes he's not, but he won't give in to that, and he'll defend anyone. He doesn't care if it's someone who wants to blow up an abortion clinic or someone who wants to protect abortion clinic, or if somebody, murders someone or whatever. He doesn't care. He thinks everybody deserves the best defense that he can give them. It's not even about the money, it's about winning. And so we see Charlie grow up, because we meet her in the opening of the book. She's 13. And then as she's older, closer to 40, she realizes how full of shit her father is. She still loves him. I think it's a lot of girls go through that. I did with my own dad. I thought he was perfect when I was a little girl. And then as an adult, I really understand why he's been married so many times.
I'm luckier than you are. My dad was like my dad all the way through till the day he died. It was wonderful. But I've always thought I was really fortunate. Plus, I'm the oldest. It makes a big difference where you are in your family, how you perceive your parents.
Well, your parents are older, right, when they have the younger children, so they're not as, I guess, tense about it, maybe.
Yeah, it's partly that. Some of it is economics. I mean, if it's been any kind of, my brother is 7 years younger than I am, always belonged to a country club and didn't, and I remember Rob and I were just in Colorado doing, Colorado things where you're supposed to be like good in the woods and all of it. And I said to him, I never got to camp because when I wanted to go, I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, so we didn't have any convenient woods or anything. When I really wanted to go was in the second grade, and my parents couldn't afford to send me then. By the time my brother came along, he was joining a country club and the whole bit. So, it really makes a big difference sometimes, your place in the family, and that would affect how you perceive your parents. But I thought your title, when I said deeply ironic, is what is a good daughter? And you can look at it in a variety of ways. And so I thought it was an excellent title for the book.
Well, thank you.
Too bad. I like pretty girls. So, can we talk about, any of the basic themes of the book besides that, or are they all going to be spoilers? I really debated what we could talk about now without ruining this book for those of you who haven't yet read it. I'm sure you don't want us to, because it's been out a week, I think, right?
Yes.
Although Karin was telling me at dinner that she's been on tour since early June because she has published in like 100 countries, and she hasn't been all of them, but you've been to at least some since June.
Yeah, I've been to the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Italy, England, here, the United States.
A foreign country,
yes.
right here.
And I'm going to Brazil after this, so quite a bit.
Right, so you've talked about different things, so...
I have. And it's great because now I have one publisher internationally, and they're all trying to publish the same book at the same time. I was in Croatia once for 4 days, and I didn't realize until the last day what book I was actually touring with. So it was a Will Trent, so there's just general themes and yeah.
Gotcha. Based upon what you've been talking about, is there anything you could say that you feel won't be a spoiler?
Well, it's about lawyers. That's not a spoiler. I'll tell you, it was really hard not to kill all of them.
That's a Shakespeare line. You all know that line from Richard III? First thing we'll do, we'll kill all the lawyers. Yeah, it's a great line. Laurence Olivier delivered that with real style.
He knew it. So I mentioned earlier Alistair Burke is a good friend of mine, and I love Linda Fairstein or Marcia Clark, or I know a lot of writers who are legit lawyers, right? I mean, Linda had an amazing career in sex crimes, and Alifair, she's got a Stanford law degree. She was a prosecutor in Oregon. She's a Hofstra law professor. She writes her own books, and then she writes really different books with Mary Higgins Clark. And I feel like an ass for complaining about having to write one book a year, because she's so amazing. And she can talk about anything, but when she talks about the law, it's like a switch turns on, right? I mean, you know what I'm talking about, because they train it into you, right?
Yes, they do.
And it's always fascinating me that she has that side of her that is just so brilliant that I don't even know anything about it. And I wanted to write that kind of person, right? And so that's one of the reasons why when Charlie grows up, she becomes a lawyer, is because I wanted to write about someone like Alifair. But the thing is, once I decided that, Alifair said, well, she's a defense lawyer. I don't understand that job. And I said,
true, 'cause she's a prosecutor.
yeah, she's a prosecutor. And I think we all understand prosecutors, right? Because they're putting away the bad guys. And we don't, occasionally we'll see something on Netflix or whatever, and it worries us that maybe they're not doing a great job. But for the most part, we think cops and prosecutors and all those people are just out for justice, right? Well, they're really not. Someone, I was in Indianapolis, and this guy said, I was a defense lawyer for 40 years, and they're all liars and cheats. And I thought, okay, well, that's a nice blanket statement. I'm sure they'd say the same thing about you. But I wanted to talk to a bunch of defense lawyers. And in Atlanta, we have a lot of athletes and musicians, and Justin Bieber lives there, for what that's worth. And a lot of them get accused of rape and murder, and they have drug charges. And so we've got some really hotshot lawyers. So I wanted to run the gamut, talk to the hotshot lawyers and the lawyers who only get paid by the state, and they get paid very little by the state. That's the other thing that was shocking, is how little we pay lawyers to help indigent clients. I mean, it's a wonder they all don't just kill themselves rather than have to go through the system like that. And it was really interesting because, a lot of them, the first thing they said was, my job is to level the playing field. Because the fact is, prosecutors are incentivized to overcharge, because they always want to appear hard on crime, because that's what voters want. Voters vote for prosecutors. But also, prosecutors worry all the time that if they let someone go or they're soft on them, that person will end up doing something horrible, and that's going to be on their conscience. So it's there's a lot more going on than just a strict reading of the Constitution. And this one woman I spoke with, who was a defense lawyer in juvenile court and later became a juvenile judge, said to me, I had this kid, 16 years old, and he saved up for 3 years cutting grass and doing chores to buy his own car. So when he turned 16, he would have a car. And his first night out on his birthday, he was speeding, and he got pulled over. And he mouthed off to the cop, which you don't do. And he kept mouthing off to the cop, and the cop pulled him out of the car and searched the car, right? And he found a bag of pot in the glove compartment. And what the kid didn't know is the person he had bought the car from had a bag of pot down at the back of the seat. So he went from having a little bag of pot to having a lot of pot. And he kept mouthing off, which, again, you don't do. And he ended up being arrested that night. And he could have gone to prison for 4 years. And the woman said, so I had to talk to the prosecutor and say, look, this kid, he's never been in trouble before. He is anchored in the community. He does well in school. He's got good support at home. Let's get him in a diversion program. Because if you're not a criminal when you go into prison, you will be when you come out. And so she basically saved this kid's life. And I asked all these, I think everybody understands that, right? That's the kind of defense lawyering you can get behind. But I asked every one of these lawyers I spoke with, how do you feel if you get someone off for rape or murder and then they do it again? And this woman said to me, they tell you in law school it's not your fault, that you just have to do the best job you can to defend your client, and whatever the system does, that's the system's fault. But it's happened. And she said, I'll tell you what, except for being able to help kids like I did that time, and having more good cases than bad, I wouldn't be able to get out of bed, because sometimes the really bad people do get off. And she said, and You know, it's very rare that one of my clients is actually innocent. They're all guilty of something. Usually they're guilty of what they're charged with, but I have to negotiate that. And I thought, okay, well that seems like a reasonable thing to say. I mean, we all have parts of our job we don't like. And then I talked to like the really high price, $2,500 an hour guy who defends athletes and people like that. And I said, well, how do you feel if he gets off and he does it again? And this guy said, well, why do you think that he was guilty the first time? And I thought, well, that's why people hate lawyers. But then he said, you know, it's not my job. It's the prosecutor's job to prove that he's guilty. So if they can't prove that he's guilty, then the police aren't doing their job, the prosecutor's not doing their job, forensic people, all down the line, they haven't done their job. It's not my fault. And I said, but don't you ever feel a little bad? And he said, no, because that's justice. And I thought, that's the kind of lawyer Rusty is. And there's a big gap between that kind of lawyer, which Rusty is, and that kind of lawyer, which Charlie is. And I thought that would be a really good source of, you know, Charlie loves her father, but the fact that that's how he thinks is something that really upsets her.
There's so many ethical trapdoors in the law. Actually, also in practicing medicine anymore today, because the law is always way behind where medicine is, and so you can have tremendous debates about, you know, ending life and right to life and the whole bit. But did any of you read? I'm catching up with the papers while I was gone, so I'm not sure if it was today's paper or a little bit earlier about El Chapo. And was that in today's paper? No. Well, anyway, here's the deal. You know, the Mexican drug guy that, you know, managed to escape, we got him over here and so forth. And he's been so far represented by public defender on our taxpayer dollar, which doesn't go well with me anyhow. But anyway, here he is. And he wants to hire these really high-priced lawyers, one of whom got John Gotti off on. So these guys represent the worst of the worst and all. Well, the deal is that because the money that the guy El Chapo has can be frozen. If the lawyers get paid, the government can freeze their account. So basically what they're saying is, we don't want to defend him for free, but if we can't be guaranteed that, you know, we're going to get our money, then we're not going to do it. And I thought that's the first time I could remember actually reading that it was really just about getting paid. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about the right, you know, to be defended or anything. That this whole discussion was just about, you know, if they invested their time, were they going to get some enormous fee? And so they wanted the family to guarantee that the money wasn't going to be related to drugs and therefore could be confiscated and they could get paid. And I thought, you know, yuck.
That's why people hate lawyers.
Well, right. I know you keep looking at me. I'm a bookseller now. Oh, come on, I gave it up. It's a lot more fun to be a lawyer. I mean, to be a bookseller. Sorry.
Oh, did you hear that? So Rob, are you watching?
No. It's actually a terrific foundation for running a business, because you know what you do learn if you study law is you learn to think about consequences. If you're an estate lawyer and you're drafting a will, your whole job is to go, what if? It's just like writing a book. It's exactly the same kind of thing as plotting a book, you know? You have to say, you know, if this, then what? And you have to try to, you know, figure out all the contingencies. So it's really very good training for, you know, piloting things along without the ethical trapdoors, you know, that are going on. So that was what interested you primarily in writing this book?
Well, yeah, because obviously I'm not a lawyer, so I needed to rely on a lot of lawyers. But I do love legal dramas. I love Grisham.
But you're not a cop either, you know, and you do write about, you know, will, and you wrote about...
No, but I think I could go to the police academy and I could do all that. I don't know that I could necessarily go to law school. I was interested in it when I was in high school, and we had a moot court. And I still get angry about this, but the judges were kind of like half-assing it because they didn't want to do it, and their wives probably had volunteered them because they were real judges. And the other side was allowed to have evidence entered that wasn't allowed by the rules, and I knew that it wasn't allowed by the rules, and I tried to say something, and the judge wouldn't listen to me, and we lost, and I didn't like losing. And I especially didn't like losing because the judge didn't know the rules.
Yeah.
And my teacher said, well, that's what being a lawyer is. And I said, well, screw that. I'll write a book.
Revenge is a dish best eaten cold. Well, no, but I mean, you have written a lot of books that have involved cops and police procedure and all. And when you do that, you have to at least have the appearance of verisimilitude, even if maybe you screw up some of the. I'm not saying you did, but if you screwed up some of the procedure. Is that one reason you like writing standalones, to take you out of, that area, so you don't have to think about that for a while?
A little bit, but you have to think of it. It's a different challenge, because when you're not writing from the point of view of a cop or a doctor, a medical examiner, people like that, you have to contrive believable reasons for the narrators to be involved in the crime. And I don't like to write these, people making unbelievably stupid mistakes and suddenly there's a dead body. I don't like writing this. I don't want to write this kind of books. I've liked one or two of them, but I think that it's really hard to maintain. And so, I had to find a way for them to be involved in this and know a lot about what was going on. And so I thought, well, if they're lawyers, then that way I can get into it. But with Will, there are other challenges, because with Will and Sarah, a lot of times, like when they kept woman, things as a reader that they don't know, and I love doing that kind of stuff. Like a lot of people really love Will. I love Will, but he lies all the time. And women think he's great. Men think he's great. They're like, oh, he's so wonderful. I wish my husband was Will. And I'm like, well, okay, one, he's fictional because he takes out the trash and washes the dishes, right? And he's fantastic in bed every time. But he does. He tells a lot of lies because he just doesn't want to deal with the consequences of the things he's done. And I love doing stuff like that in the books. And I love that it's eventually, maybe not this next book, but eventually it's going to catch up with him.
Ooh. So also, you've gone back and forth from big city, Atlanta, to small towns. You've been in the county, and in this book, you're in a small town. How's that different, when you're shaping up the landscape of the story?
Well, small towns have changed an awful lot from when I was growing up in one, for instance. And cities have changed. I mean, we talked about this a little bit at dinner. Cities have changed a lot. So in my state of Georgia, Atlanta is responsible for 85% of the state taxes collected. And that's used for a lot of health care and disability and school lunches and after-school programs and helping the police force and having a state police force and state crime labs and things like that really small communities benefit from. And I'm worried because there's such a divide now between rural and city that people in the city are going to get really angry at people in the rural parts and stop wanting to share the wealth. Because small towns are really as close to socialism as we can come right now. Because it's like Mississippi. I mean, a lot of people in Mississippi want to get rid of California, but it's the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. And Mississippi gets back, I think, $3 for every $1 they send to the federal government. So a lot of us would be screwed if California dropped off the face of the earth, right? And I think that financially we need to understand how more entangled we are than we'd like to believe. And also that there's not a lot of difference between us, because I like I said, I grew up in a small town. Most of my writing is done in a small town in North Georgia called Blue Ridge that I love. My father lives there. He's been there forever. And there are great people there, and they want good jobs. They want their kids to go to school and get a good education. And they want their kids to get good jobs. They want to have a nice steak at least once a week. That's not very far removed from what people living in big cities want, I mean, we all want the same thing, but it's so polarized right now. And one of the lines in the book that I really like is something that my grandmother used to say, because in my small town, I was really weird. I didn't really fit in. And when I moved to Atlanta, everybody said, well, we thought she would. But every town, and I've been traveling a lot in Europe, and Europe is just a bunch of small towns, basically. And just like America is a bunch of small towns. Even within Atlanta, people don't say, I'm from Atlanta. I live in Atlanta. They say I live in Morningside or Buckhead, the same way people in New York say I live in the Upper East Side. Or that's their identity, is their neighborhood or their town. And, you know, just looking at all of the things that are so similar in neighborhoods, in small towns. You know, there's the really wealthy people, the people who aren't as well off. There's the kind of crimey kind of family. We all know that. There's the woman who cheats all the time on her husband. You know, the single mom who is barely getting by. All these casts of characters, they're everywhere, all over the world, all over the Western world, all over neighborhoods, everywhere. And my grandmother said this to me: every town has someone who doesn't belong. That's what makes them belong. And I thought, you know, this is the Quinn family in The Good Daughter, is that this kind of quirky family that doesn't quite belong, and some tragedy happens to them, which, you know, weirdly, when really bad things happen to weird people, we kind of like them more, right? Because we think, oh, they're normal now, or, you know, acceptable in some way. And so that was really my focus, was you know, talking about small towns again, and just how dependent we really are on each other, and how much we need each other in the world. I mean, we're all Americans. That's not going to change. We need to, like, stop all this crap of thinking we're so different when we really are the same.
And not only are we all the same, but, you know, when I was reading about Brexit, I realized that London generates, what was it, like 65% of the entire economy of Britain. And London wanted to stay in the EU, and it was the north part of Britain primarily that voted to leave. So that same kind of gap that you were just mentioning is also true there. And, you know, I don't know how that will get reconciled, but the world is moving urban. It just is, you know, for jobs and other things. I've been in Peru 4 times, and every time I go, you can see that more and more people have moved to the cities than, you know, away from the highlands and away. Lima's gotten up to something like 9,000 people. And it's divided into something like 36 communities, each of which has its own mayor and its own council, so they can't even put together a decent road system through the city, because every part of the road belongs to, you know, another of these. And so I don't know how your neighborhood thing, you know, is really prevalent, but as we got more internet and more, you know, all these reasons that people want to live closer to those, like China, which is doing a massive social engineering project.
Yeah, they're recreating the
There
Silk
are going to
Road.
be fewer small towns and more metro areas.
Well,
even in
that's
Arizona, you know, I mean, think about it. We've got Phoenix, we've got Tucson, but, you know, otherwise it's relatively small, because most of the land here is either federal or Indian or state-owned. I think it's a very small percentage, maybe 20. Does anybody know exactly? Of Arizona's in private. It's a very small amount of private land. Yeah.
Well, and that worries me, because I feel, even as someone who lives in a big city, I feel like we should support each other, you know? And I want kids in rural areas. I'm a big library supporter. I have a library charity, and, you know, we've given money to bookmobiles who service communities that are so small they don't have libraries. And we you know, in some of these rural areas, kids, their only access to the internet and books is at school.
Or the library.
Well, if they don't have a library, they
Oh,
don't
that's
have
true.
that, yeah. And so what we're saying to these people is, your kids don't matter. We don't want them to be able to use the internet. And a lot of them, if they do have the internet at home, it's on dial-up. You know, if you think about the WPA and, like, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought electricity into the part of the country I'm in, you know, up in the mountains, that was one of the best public works projects of all times, and we still subsidize electricity there so that people can be part of the 21st or even the 20th century, really. And I think it's so important that we do things like that, and we don't leave people out, because, I mean, it just seems undemocratic to me to do that. And so that's why we really, as part of my focus of my charity, we focus on libraries in rural towns. You know, a lot of those kids, no one is around to read to them because their parents have 4 and 5 jobs. And at night, you know, they're just happy to get dinner on the table and spend some time with their kids and their spouse. And so to be able to drop them at a library on a Saturday and they have a reading program, that's a gift. And I think that's so necessary, because otherwise those kids are just going to be left behind for the rest of their lives.
Well, I asked you that question because I think The Good Daughter would be an entirely different book if you'd set it in Metro Atlanta than in this small town. So I think the character of the book is or part of it's the family and the characters, but an awful lot of it is the small town. What are you working on now? You're writing Will Trent, the one that you were writing until you were writing this?
No, he needs to come off his fly fishing. No, the next book I'm working on, I can't talk too much about it, but it does have an international flair. Don't worry, not too much of one. But the one after that will be a Will Trent. I'm really excited about it. The problem is, stuff keeps happening in the news, and it's like, well, I can't write about that. I can't write about that. I mean, it's stranger than fiction in some ways. So, this is a really bad time for crime writers. You want to talk about, like, the militia or whatever. I mean, we're just completely screwed, which is, I'm taking it as a personal affront.
Okay, well, on that note, how about questions from any of you? Because I think we've said all we can about the book. Yes?
Would you recommend reading The Last Breath before we...
Oh, so Last Breath is a short story I wrote with Charlie, because in the beginning of The Good Daughter, you meet her when she's 13, and then, because I can't write about kids that age without wanting to kill them all, immediately in the next chapter, she's almost 40. And
that's cruel, because I thought one of the advantages of fiction is you could age
Right?
people like week between books or something,
Exactly.
and they stay forever young while
Yeah.
you meantime turned into a senior.
I wish I could do that, yeah. Well, Will does that, Will and Sarah. Actually, Will is younger in some books than he is in later books, because the old noggin doesn't work that well. But Last Breath is Charlie when she's in her 30s. And I really, when you're a 13-year-old girl, life is so complicated, and you got so much going on. And then you're 20 and you're in college and you're hoping to meet somebody, and you're 30 and you've met that person and hopefully you're still with them, and you're trying to get your career started and all this, and then 40 you're like, oh, what happened, And you're looking back at your life, and honestly, like when I was turned 40 last year, I thought, oh my God, I just never realized I was going to get this old. If I only knew then what I know now, right?
So you lie for a living, right?
Exactly.
You just done that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
And so I wanted to check in with her in her 30s, because one part of this book that I really loved is I wanted to write about a woman who was really in love with her husband, because that's not something you read a lot. I love Leanne Moriarty because I think she does that really well. I mean, a lot of the husbands are assholes, but there's always one who's just like a great guy, and she really loves her husband, and he loves her. And I'll tell the guys in this room, the number one thing that women find sexiest in a man is a man who respects women. And if you read Leanne Moriarty, and if you read this book, Charlie is with a guy who really respects her and loves her. But she screwed things up in a way that is not a traditional way, I'll say that. But I wanted to get to her before that, and so Last Breath was my opportunity to write about it. But to answer your question, a lot of people are purists and they want to read it in order. So technically, it's in the middle, so you should, after you read that first chapter, you should read it. I wrote it after the book, though, so if you want to do that, I think it works either way. And Barbara, you know this because you're a publisher, but a lot of times when you write a book, the publisher, like you deliver it, and a week later they say, oh, well, we were just talking to sales and we thought maybe if you could do a short story that connects to the book that we can put out before the book to help drive pre-orders, that would be great. They say it the same way every time, right? Yeah. Every year they say that. And if I can't think of something, I say no. Because I just don't want to do it. I don't want to, I mean, what's the point of having a really crappy story? And so this time I just had something I really loved, an idea for her where she's just started out in her law degree. She's a little more gullible than when you meet her later in the book. But it was a lot of fun. So I know I didn't really answer your question, but I've given you lots of options.
I'm confused. Are you saying that you can read this and then you should divert to the story, and then is there a bookmark?
Maybe.
Maybe there's a bookmark.
Yeah. Well, in the prologue, she's 13. Yeah, and then you can read when she's 30, where she doesn't talk about anything really that happens in here.
But that's so interesting, because let's face it, when you're making up a character, you have to just like pick a place. You know, you have to pick an age and pick where they are and pick what's going on, and then as you write them, you recognize that they had a life before that, unless you're, you know, starting out someplace in the nursery. And that can be interesting. I often think that's why so many people who write series write prequels. They just, you know, at some point you really want to know more about that character that you started out at, let's say, age 32 or something. So that's what you're saying more or less happened to you.
Well, you know, when I first wrote about Will Trent and Triptych, I had one more Grant County book to do, and I knew that.
Right.
But I also knew when I was writing Triptych that in about 3 or 4 books I would write criminal, which it goes in the past, and you meet Amanda in the 1970s. Amanda's Will's boss. Because the thing is, she's a real ball breaker. And every woman knows a woman like Amanda. She gets to the top, and instead of helping you up the ladder, she kicks you in the face. And she thinks that I went through hell, so you have to go through hell too. And she's harder on the women who work for her than she is for the men. And so I thought, well, why is she that way? And I started writing about what it was like to be a policewoman in the 1970s, and I thought, why didn't she just kill everybody? I mean, because it was a really tough job, a really tough time for single women in particular. I mean, you couldn't get a credit card, you couldn't buy a house, you couldn't get a car loan without a man co-signing, or you couldn't get birth control unless you were married. Until the Supreme Court made it legal, and then still, as we know, even though the Supreme Court makes something legal, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to comply. So, I mean, it was just a really tough time. So, but I knew that was coming because I wanted to explore Will's origin story. So, I do think about backward and forward and all those things when I write the characters.
Why did you draw a line under Grant County? Did you said all you wanted to say about Grant County?
Everybody was too happy.
Not the stuff of fiction, right?
No,
Not the stuff
no.
of crime fiction, anyway. No,
Yeah,
seriously.
well,
I thought it was an interesting question.
Well, even Maeve Binchy, you know, the characters aren't very happy in the beginning of the book. They end up really happy, but I thought, well, 2 things. One was the relationship that was at the center of that story seemed to have run its course, because the next thing to do would have kids, and kids are really boring in books, and unless they're like convenient children who only show up to move the plot forward, and I didn't want to really do that. That's why Faith's mother will live forever and always be capable of taking care of her children, so Faith can go off and be a cop. But, you know, I also thought there's so many people getting murdered and mutilated and raped in this small town, and I'm kind of running out of people to do that to. You know? So why? I guess they can't sell their houses because who wants to live there? But you know, I didn't want to be the Jessica Fletcher of Grant County, and as a writer, I didn't want to write the same books over and over again. There are some writers like Peter Robinson who can write about one specific part of the country very well and find new and interesting ways to talk about setting and story and all that. And I think he's remarkable in that way. But for me, I just didn't see a lot, because I always think 3 or 4 books ahead of time, and I didn't see a lot of opportunities to do something different. And I want to write different books each time. I don't want to write the same book over and over again. I think some writers do a wonderful job. I love Janet Ivanovich, but I don't know which is the last book I read, if it's the one where she was with Ranger or Joe, but that's basically the plot of every single one. But I love it. I love reading it. It's great fun. I pre-order every single one, but as a writer, I want to do something different, and so that's why I decided to do that.
Okay. Another question? Anyone?
Over here? No?
We silenced you. Come on, guys. Yes, you again.
Me again. I'm definitely a fan. Can you tell us, like, what's a typical day when you go up to the mountain and how you start off?
Well, it's about 2 hours outside of Atlanta, and what I do to prepare myself is listen to a lot of country music, because there's some great storytelling in that, and I love hymns. I listen to a lot of hymns about suffering and that sort of thing. Puts me in the right mind for it. And then I block out 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and I'm just up there by myself at the cabin. My dad's down the road, and sometimes I'll open the door and he's left soup and cornbread for me, or a little note that says bathe. because I call it my Sammies and Jammies because I just eat sandwiches and wear my pajamas all the time, and I just get up in the morning and I start writing, and I keep writing for however long I can write, and if I get a little lightheaded, I'll eat something, or sometimes I'll take a power nap, and I do that for 15, 16, sometimes 18 hours a day, and I don't sleep much, and I'm kind of in this crazy fog, which is why it's good that I'm alone when I'm doing this, and I just write, and I've always had that kind of schedule, because when I first started writing, I would get up in the morning before work and write, and then after work I would write, and then on the weekends I would write, so I had these finite amounts of time, and I couldn't be precious about it. I couldn't be, staring at my navel saying, what will they do next? I had to be really prepared, because that was my time to do it, and so that's how I've done it since the first book, and it's worked out, but it's hell on my body. I slipped a disc in my back, and I know, right? Because I just have a really crappy posture anyway.
Like this, or
yeah,
the computer.
yeah. So, I blame the books.
Well, many of us who spend too long at computers have really bad body habits. Yeah. My husband developed bursitis in his elbow, and I was trying to figure, and I realized only it's because he's always like this, looking at his screen. He's always on this elbow, and eventually it catches up with you. Indeed.
I don't know. Past a certain age, if you cross your legs too long, you get up and you limp.
Now, it's an interesting thing talking to writers over the years. Your question is asked at virtually every, author event. Everyone has a different answer, and what I think it often comes down to is whatever worked for you at the beginning, you don't want to give it up because then maybe it won't work.
Yeah. Well, I listened to like Mike Connolly or Laura Lippman or people who came from newspaper backgrounds.
That's different.
And they had a deadline every day.
Right.
I have one deadline at the end of the year, so the end of the year is the busiest time for me.
Sure.
But like on Laura's Facebook page, she's like, "Oh, I wrote for I had breakfast. I took the kid to school. I wrote for 4 hours. Went to yoga class." And you think, I just hate you.
Yoga, who has time?
Right. Yeah. Well, you do if you have like a real schedule, like a normal person, I guess.
But that is my point, is that creative process works differently in everybody. So there is no absolutely right answer. Sometimes I think when people answer that question, they hope it's transferable. That if she gives you like a plan, you can adapt it or adopt
Don't do it.
Go over it.
Laura's.
It really isn't going to work for you, just because it works for Karin. Right. And also, it's hard on the people that you live with to do that. So, it depends on how it, how it
Well, I
goes
didn't
on.
realize that I talk sometimes when I write. Like I'll say it aloud until my cats started coming into the room. Like, yes.
I just found out about you, so I'm a very new person to your books. So this will be the first book I'm reading.
Ooh, how exciting.
And then
A virgin. How often do you get to be one?
Usually when I come here, I know the author and have read their books. But so I'm going to start this book for the first time. And then I have the Will Trent series to read afterwards. So because I am brand new, what is something that you have everybody else in the room would know, but I wouldn't know about you or the books?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one.
That is an original question.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Well, if everybody's on my Facebook page, they know I love cats. That's a really hard question. I don't know if I can think that much.
I've read all her books, and now I'm desperately trying to think of.
What's something interesting about me, Barbara? We just don't know.
No, there's a huge number of things that are interesting about you, but what is it that?
Bookstore?
Do I what?
On the bookstore?
No, not me. I'm not that crazy. No.
There are a surprising number of authors who are now
Yeah.
owning bookstores, but
Yeah, if you want to be a millionaire, be a billionaire who invests in a bookstore, right? Is that the
that's like the old wisdom about a yacht,
Right,
Yeah,
yeah. But Barbara has a good store. I'm still trying to think of something interesting about
Or
me.
about one of your characters, or
Well, Will Trent is dyslexic. So she's like, oh, yeah.
it's always good to know.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. I like
Well,
that.
you know, I try to include people with disabilities in my writing because I have an uncle who's mentally disabled. My sister has struggled with some reading issues. And I think that it's important to be inclusive. And I don't make it like a pivotal part of the story, but when I was thinking about writing about Will, I wanted him to be very different from the character we mentioned earlier, Jeffrey Tolliver. And Jeffrey was a history major. He's very athletic. He played college football until he realized he didn't like to get hit anymore. And so Will was kind of more a cerebral answer to that. And I like the idea of him being someone who had a secret, because I think that it makes him a really good detective because he understands that people are hiding things and he doesn't really judge them for hiding them. And it makes him able to, I think, bring people out and talk to him about stuff. But you know, also importantly, if you look up the characteristics of most dyslexics, they're generally very mechanical, very driven, very good at picking up societal cues, because a lot of them, you know, when my sister was growing up with her issues, the teachers just said she was stupid. You know, we didn't really have teachers who were looking for disabilities. They weren't trained for that. And so Will has a lot of shame attached to that. But also he's kind of this physical, manly kind of guy. And, you know, I wanted to write something I didn't really see. I read a lot of fiction in general, and a lot of crime fiction, and I love flawed people. I think that people, maybe that's because I'm Southern, and, you know, when I would go to church with my grandmother, and she would introduce me to her friend, she'd always say something awful as soon as they turned their back, like, well, you know she drinks. Or that one's husband wears her underwear. You know, there was like, so I always think people have these deep, dark secrets because of that. And I try to bring that into the stories. Well, this woman appreciates that.
I think you're
You
right.
had a grandmother like that too, did you?
I think we make
Well, I think on that note, possibly we should end this before we digress a little bit too far. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a hand over there.
I just
Excuse
have a
me.
quick question.
Sure.
So I'm kind of new to your books as well. I've read a couple, and I love that they're really dark and twisted and messed up. But on that note, why did you get into writing thrillers?
Why did I get into writing thrillers? Well, I love thrillers. I read a lot of true crime when I was growing up, like The Stranger Beside Me and Helter Skelter. And I've always been drawn to dark stories. And when I was a kid, my dad would tell us really, really awful stories about, some of them were like the little girl who left open the refrigerator door and died. There was like always these really high stakes, and someone ended up losing a limb. I mean, he was like the male Flannery O'Connor of our family. And one time I had this interviewer come up to the mountains and interview me. And I had told her how my dad was, and she met my dad, and he was perfectly normal. And she was just kind of looking at me, and then she was leaving, and she said, "Oh, which is the best way to go?" And he said, "Well, if you go over this bridge, they call it Massacre Bridge, but I really call it the Dead Body Bridge because there was a dead body under there, and they burned it, but they didn't burn it enough." And she looked at me like, and I said, I told you. I mean, that's how, and I'm the youngest of three girls, and my earliest stories were all about my sisters being killed. My dad would give me $0.25 each book, so there was like a total financial incentive for me, and gruesome things. And writing about murder, there's only a certain number, especially when you're 7. A certain number of ways that you can think to kill people. So, that whole wood chipper thing from Fargo, I did that when I was 7.
I'm so happy that I wasn't your teacher. Wow.
Me too.
Yeah, that was scary. Wow, I could have been. Right, okay. So let's give Karin a round of applause.
Thank you.